Hello everyone, my name is Nick, and today I'm giving a presentation on my Keystone project, which was a senior thesis in history on German colonialism in China. This was advised by Professor Hua, who is a historian of 20th century Chinese history, and a special shout out as well to Professor Menegan, who was in charge of the seminar for all senior thesis writers. I believe they're watching on the live stream, so hi. And I believe this is the only history thesis being presented here, so count yourselves lucky. Anyway, by the way, oral presentation is tough for me. I may need to take a breather for a second, but I'll probably be fine. So when I say German colonialism in China, your first question is probably there was a German colony in China, which, good question. I don't blame you because it only existed for about 16 years from 1898 to 1914, 1914 being when the Japanese army decided to invade to cripple Germany after World War I broke out. In the late 19th century, European powers pretty widely wanted a piece of China for this or that reason. This ranged from port cities like Hong Kong to smaller areas like concessions in cities like Tianjin and Shanghai, and Germany wanted one of those ports like Hong Kong to themselves. In fact, in Chinese, they had this metaphor, guafen zhongguo, literally meaning cutting China up like a watermelon. And anyway, Germany found its slice of the melon, as it were, in 1897 when it occupied what the locals called the Jiaozhou Bay, and what the Germans, being Germans, called the Kiaochou Bay. The major city, which is often used as shorthand for the colony, was Qingdao, or as it was known then, Tsingtao. And if that name sounds familiar, that is in fact the name of a Chinese beer brand that was actually started because the Germans began a brewery there. So this map real quick just shows the terms of the treaty between the Germans and the Chinese, which was technically only a 99-year lease of the colony. The area outlined in red, that is actually the only area that, does this work? Yeah. No, it doesn't. It's pointed to the whatever. The red area there is the only area that actually belonged fully to Germany. That was the protectorate of Kiaochou. You can see Qingdao there, and then that big circle is something called the neutral zone or the buffer zone, in which Germany was able to move troops and build railroads, but was still nominally Chinese sovereignty. But the focus of my thesis is the 1905 turn in German colonialism. German colonialism was, of course, defined by racism, being a European colonial project. They conceived of themselves as in this sort of class of civilizations. This lithograph, oh, that's not the right button. This lithograph here on the right is actually drawn by the German Kaiser himself, or rather sketched by the German Kaiser himself and finalized by another artist, and shows, the great forces of Christian Europe getting ready to delve into the Buddha engulfed in flames in the East. But interestingly, around 1905, historians of the colony roundly agree that there was a move toward certain more racial equality in the colony, basically. We shouldn't excuse colonialism, of course, but there were certain policies like, so the segregation laws started to deteriorate. German troops were withdrawn from the buffer zone. The Germans weren't allowed to have them in the buffer zone, but they were there anyway at first, and so on. So my thesis attempts to answer this question. Why did the 1905 turn happen? To answer this, I turn to a materialist analysis of class in mainland Germany. There is an ongoing debate in the field about the ruling class in Germany. Some people believe it was entirely dominated by the bourgeoisie, but I argue that the aristocracy, which refers to people who were born into their wealth, they often had von in their last names. These are the people with, the old-fashioned wealth that they did not earn, they were born into. And the bourgeoisie refers, for my purposes, to the middle classes and up who were wealthy, but they got there by success on the free market. They were not born into any special families. And the question then is, who exactly was in charge of Germany? Who was the ruling class? And I argue that both classes held considerable power and were more interconnected than we think. And that this state of connection, this sort of transition, actually explains the transitional, uneven transition toward greater racial equality in Kiaochou. An example of how closely connected the classes were was dueling. This was just, if you were in a bourgeois college fraternity in Germany in the 1800s, you would just do sword fight duels with your friends, genuinely. And even well into the 20th century, having one of those dueling scars was considered a badge of honor in Germany. Anyway, that was a very aristocratic tradition, the idea that you would duel to preserve some honor that you were born with. But the fact that the bourgeois engaged in it as well shows how closely those classes were interlinked. The aristocracy in Kiautschou, I map onto very specific policies in Kiautschou, especially in the early years when they had a more prominent role in the colonial administration. I also argue, following other scholars, that because their power came from birth, they were naturally more compatible with racism. They were accustomed to the idea that the circumstances of your birth affected your power in society. They played a larger role in the early years of Kiautschou, including the urban planning of Qingdao, which involved all kinds of segregation and discrimination into different districts based on wealth and especially race. In fact, the rules were so strict that one thing I found in my research was that if you were a Chinese worker who was a servant of a German, you were actually forbidden to eat garlic, or at least to smell like it, because the Germans were unfamiliar and did not like it. It would take them some time to grow accustomed to seasoning their food. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, were still harbored plenty of prejudiced ideals, but because they came from professions, like teachers, academics, merchants, they preferred greater collaboration with the Chinese. They would like to be able to teach them, to trade with them, and so on. And they had a long history, this middle class, of reforming Germany, including in 1848, which was the time of a bourgeois revolution in Germany. And in that revolution, they advocated for Germany's naval politics, which is one of the many connections between class at home and the colony abroad, because I can prove all I want about what was happening in Germany, but it's important to actually connect that to what was happening in the colony. Naval policy is a major one. The bourgeois liberals in Germany, who had more and more influence as the colony got older and older, passionately believed not just in establishing a colony overseas, but in working with the Chinese as merchants. This clock I show on the right is an interesting artifact to that point. It shows basically it has lines on it showing all the time zones of the various German colonies in a sort of the sun never sets on our empire kind of thing. I mean, that's literally what they wrote on the clock face. And at the bottom, it also says, our future lies on the water. Showing like a ship. By the way, that ship, the wooden ship, is literally labeled trade in German. It just says trade. And it is flanked by naval ships, in case there was any ambiguity about what it could possibly mean. So anyway, the significance of my research is mainly combating oversimplified narratives about the history of Kiautschou. The idea that some of my other scholars have proposed that that Germany at this time was entirely bourgeois. I argue that the aristocracy still played a major role in Germany and in the colony. And in general, I just moved towards an explanation of a key historical moment that, in general, everyone is well aware of the 1905 shift, but why it actually happened remains somewhat of a mystery, and I approach a theory of causation for that. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
So I'm currently taking a class on the history of stuff and the architecture, the history of stuff explicitly. But the architecture featured in the last image, and also just a lot of the tangible physical examples that you've provided, I feel like provide a really interesting lens into some of the trends that you're discussing. How have you felt like physical objects, or I guess stuff, has informed the way that you've approached this project?
Mm-hmm. Right away, architecture, as you pointed out, is actually a huge part of this. A lot of the works I read focused heavily on architecture, too much so. Well, not too much, but it was a very big deal. One of the many ways the gradual transition towards less racism was shown was that the buildings in Kiautschou began to implement more and more traditional Chinese architectural styles. So yeah, absolutely. And in general, I've really enjoyed using popular culture in this and the thesis I wrote. Stuff like songbooks. I found it was like a program of studies for middle school in the colony. So yeah, that has been really fun. It's one of the fun parts of history for me to interact with all kinds of different artifacts. And it is really useful for showing what I'm trying to prove.
Congrats, Nick, on a great presentation.
Thank you.
I see a what looks like a church in that photograph. I know you've done some work with missionaries that we didn't get to hear about it here. In terms of looking at like middle class colonialism, I guess. I don't know the German Empire as well, but have you come across any sort of sense of conflict among the German colony as, let's say, the first to arrive, often the missionaries, were sort of displaced by more middle-class German colonists?
Mm-hmm. Conflict over, like, there aren't enough clergymen in the colony wasn't really something that I remember seeing. To be honest, Qingdao was actually almost entirely, at least the Europeans there, were almost entirely military men in the Navy. But I will say that, yeah, religion is an important role, and I remember reading a primary source just last week about how there was, if you were a German trying to send your kid to school, I think for a while, there was like only one Catholic school, and it was like girls only. So like, you know, a parent might be like, oh, I'm a Protestant, I can't send my kid there. Or like, or actually, I guess what I mean is, I'm a Catholic parent, but I have a son, so I would have to send him to a Protestant school, which they wouldn't like. So yeah, stuff like that, just the various faiths involved, and yeah, are definitely part of it.
Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Eugenio Menegon from the History Department, and I have been one of the people who has supervised the work of Nick in the honors class. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
On finishing. Sorry I was a little late, but I can tell you I do know what he has been doing, because for the past 2 semesters...
I can confirm he does, in fact, know.
I was interested in 2 things. First, could you tell us a little bit if you found a different approach in German language secondary literature on Jiaozhou, as opposed to literature, let's say, in English or other languages? Is there some difference, historiographical difference, or difference in approach? That's my first question.
In approach, I'm not too familiar, but what I will say is, just because this is German history, there's just more German language stuff, which actually matters because, you know, like for certain under-researched elements, like especially women, gender, and sexuality in the colony, like there's just more, there's basically no English language literature on that, or there's like one book. But, you know, once you have the German sources available, then there might be like 2 or 3 books. So yeah, that's one thing I noticed. I also noticed, one difference I did notice is, I think a lot of the German histories, the modern ones are more inclined towards microhistory, which is a buzzword that some of you don't know. But basically, you know, history on a very local level that focuses on individuals rather than governments. I've seen some of that in the German works, but yeah. No, there's definitely a difference, and there's a need for more English language literature on all of this. So that's part of my contribution, is just writing in English.
Great, so we wait for the publication, obviously. And also, I know that you are going to do a master in history. Mm-hmm. You have been admitted at UMass, Hammers, maybe other places.
I'm actually still waiting on BU.
Yeah.
But other places I've gotten decisions.
But you know, maybe you need fresh air, but yes.
Yeah, who knows?
We would be ecstatic to have you here. What do you want to do when you go ahead with your master and maybe later with a PhD? Do you want to follow this kind of study of Germany abroad, or do you have other ideas, or completely different ideas?
Just in the interest of time, Nick, could you make the answer brief one?
Yeah. Short answer, yes, I do want to continue with like how Germans interact with the foreign, because lets me use my language skills, and yeah, that's just really interested me. Thank you.
Thank you.